Gracias por sus brillantes presentaciones. Vamos a arrancar primero con las preguntas dirigidas al profesor Dio y luego pasamos a las preguntas para el profesor Gould. La primera pregunta que tenemos es: tanto las fuerzas de seguridad como el fiscal no se encuentran capacitados y están interiorizados con las estadísticas y las formalidades de las que surgen o las que llevan a las condenas cerradas. ¿Qué se hace al respecto acerca de que no haya capacitación sobre esas causas de condenas cerradas?
Can you hear me? I think the question is, what can you do about the lack of police and prosecutorial training?
Yes.
Wrongful convictions?
Yes.
Yes.
It seems that in the...
Is that better?
Yes.
It seemed that at some point in the United States, when the number of wrongful convictions got large enough, that police and prosecutors started to acknowledge the problem, and in the case of police, they would put on training sessions and write in their manuals, for example, on interrogation about what the research showed about techniques to avoid. So I think what you really need is the police and the prosecutors to take the initiative to do training. And it may be that if the numbers get large enough, or they perceive that they will take the initiative to do that. It may be that they have to be forced, that a court or some governmental agent has to try to force them to do that. In the United States, we also have civil lawsuits where people who are exonerated will file lawsuits to get compensation for the wrongful convictions, which will cost municipalities or city governments, state governments, sometimes even the federal government, millions or tens of millions, or in the case of Chicago and Cook County, Illinois, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's an incentive for police and prosecutors, especially police, to do training on how to avoid making the kinds of mistakes that sometimes lead to wrongful convictions. It seems to me either they're going to see the problem or you have to make them see the problem. I'm not sure how to make them see the problem. In the United States, the media has been an ally in many instances of the innocence movement by publicizing case after case after case of wrongful conviction. But the United States seems to have more cases of wrongful conviction and more cases of exoneration than any other country, or at least discovers more of them. So I don't really have a good answer, but I would suggest putting pressure on them, trying to figure out sources of external pressure, because it's not likely that they're going to do it on their own.
Y para aclarar una cosa, saber si existe algún tipo de capacitación en particular acerca de las causas de condenas cerradas.
Okay, so the question is there any training on wrongful conviction causes? I don't think that there is training that looks across the categories of wrongful conviction, sources of error, but police do receive training, for example, on sources of error on eyewitness misidentification. Best practices with respect to lineup procedures and do's and don'ts. They receive some training on interrogation practices so as not to elicit false statements, admissions, or confessions. They receive some training about the problem of jailhouse snitches in some jurisdictions or informants, and there's been a lot of upgrading of forensic science procedures. And they receive legal training, as do prosecutors, with respect to certain practices like withholding exculpatory evidence that violate well-known constitutional rules. So they do receive issue-by-issue training, but they don't receive training across all the categories. That's, at least in my understanding, it tends to be more specialized.
Do you think they get tunnel vision training?
I don't think police get tunnel vision training. I'm not aware of them getting tunnel vision training.
Gracias. La segunda pregunta es si usted cree que el sistema policial o judicial promueve conductas que aumentan el riesgo de una condena errada, o si se trata de casos individuales que hacen parecer que es la regla.
Oh, good luck.
This might be another case for the question.
Oh, no. Good luck. Good luck.
I'm not as familiar with the Argentinian system as I should be. So the question is, are there, if I'm getting this question right, are these isolated cases, or does the system promote things that lead to wrongful convictions, or are there systemic factors or causes or sources of error? I would say that there are systemic factors. So in the United States, we have a win at all costs mentality sometimes. And first of all, I should take a step back and say, we have 18,000 different police departments. We have 50 states. I don't know how many cities we have. We have the federal government. So there's so many different law enforcement, police, and prosecutorial agencies. It's sometimes hard to generalize across all of them. But I think there is an excessive rewarding of winning. Attorneys keep track of their win-loss record. Winning shouldn't be the same thing as getting the truth. I think there is a belief that if both sides are aggressive, the truth will emerge, and that's often proven wrong. I think that there are racial biases that sometimes lead to wrongful convictions. The dirty secret also of the American criminal justice system is an emphasis on plea bargaining, which is negotiated settlements where essentially the prosecution overcharges and then reduces charges or reduces sentences in offering leniency in exchange for guilty pleas. I think that is, even though our Supreme Court won't recognize it, inherently and institutionally coercive and likely leads to a lot of errors by definition. So I think there are systemic factors that are at play. I don't think this is random. I don't think it's anomalous. I don't think it's rare or freakish, even though we don't know the exact rate. I think there are structural problems in the American criminal justice system that lead to wrongful convictions. One of the most important insights, I think, is that there's a snowball effect, because the longer the error persists, the bigger it gets and the harder it is to reverse. And so I think the place to really begin reform is with the police, because the police are the first entryway. It's where the evidence gets created. It becomes much harder down the line to reverse a wrongful to reverse the errors that sometimes lead to wrongful convictions. And so I think that may be the place to look at structural error, getting back to what Professor Gould talked about, tunnel vision in particular, but the other investigative errors as well that start the process rolling.
Gracias. La tercera pregunta es, ¿cómo se plantea en los Estados Unidos un caso de condena errónea por defensa ineficaz? La repito de vuelta. ¿Cómo se plantea en Estados Unidos un caso de condena errónea por defensa ineficaz? ¿Hay casos en los que se hayan revocado condenas firmes por ese motivo?
Yes, so would be recognized by a court. There would be litigation by the defendant in post-conviction after being wrongly convicted, and there might be a reversal by a higher court due to ineffective assistance of counsel. Now, it would have to be shown that not only was counsel ineffective, but that the ineffectiveness was material to leading to the wrongful conviction. I suspect that ineffective assistance of counsel is vastly undercounted because courts in America are not very good at finding error. Virtually all of the cases of wrongful conviction included many judicial errors, and so they're not usually a good source of identifying error. And the innocence movement is mostly led by defense attorneys who are mostly focused on errors by police and prosecutors. So it could be that this is a more serious error in terms of leading to wrongful convictions than the numbers suggest. I'm not sure.
Do you want to add to that?
No, you did, Mr.
Gracias. Nuestra última pregunta es si los policías tienen tanta libertad en Estados Unidos para interrogar, ¿cuál es el criterio o el estándar para determinar que el detenido brindó una confesión forzada o una confesión falsa? ¿Y cómo se puede probar?
I think there are two questions there. One question is, do police have a lot of freedom in the United States to interrogate? What are the limitations on that? And I think the second question is, how can we prove a confession is false? So with respect to the first question, there is no minimal threshold requirement for police prior to interrogation. So police in America could interrogate anyone. Now, if they don't have sufficient evidence to arrest, the person could say, I'm not going to cooperate, but there's no minimum evidentiary requirement. I and others have written there should be a minimal requirement before anyone can be subjected to interrogation. It could be what we call in American Fourth Amendment jurisprudence individualized suspicion, or it could be reasonable suspicion, or it could be probable cause, or it could be something else, but some minimal threshold that police have to justify to a court in order to interrogate somebody, because to interrogate somebody is to subject them to jeopardy, to the possibility that they will falsely confess. Scholars of eyewitness identification have made the same recommendation that you shouldn't be able to put somebody in a lineup because we know there's going to be lots of errors and that puts them in jeopardy of wrongful conviction. There needs to be some threshold of evidentiary threshold before you can do a lineup. And that idea has not gained any traction in the United States. So either with regard to the lineup or with regard to interrogation, police are pretty much free to do what they want in terms of getting the person in the interrogation room or putting together a lineup. And that's one of the problems that presumably in the etiology of events that leads to a false confession. With regard to proving a false confession, it's very difficult to prove that a confession is false. It's very difficult to prove anything is false, right? Philosophers say you can't prove the negative. We, in my research, have come up with 4 ways in which you can prove a confession false. If you can show that no crime occurred, and by the way, if you go to the National Registry of Exonerations, a large percentage, 40% of the cases are no crime occurred. So you could say, well, if no crime occurred, the confession is false. You could also show if it was physically impossible. When I was a professor at Professor Gould's institution in UC Irvine, I lived in a town called Laguna Beach, and before I moved there, there's been a fire that burned down 400 homes, and they got a confession from someone who it turned out when the fire was set had been in Mexico in jail. So the laws of physics showed that was physically impossible, so you could say that was provably a false confession. The DNA exoneration cases that lead to true perpetrators, scientific evidence shows those were false confessions, and then there are non-DNA cases that lead to the true perpetrator, and then you can show that the confession is false. This is a small subset, although we have hundreds and hundreds of these cases, of false confessions, or confessions that are believed to be false in the United States. And it raises a methodological issue, because in order to convince people that false confessions occur, you want to have as many as possible. But if you don't have a provably false confession or a database based on provably false confessions, then people may dispute, well, I think this is true, you say it's false. And that's why we have that category of proven false confession. Now, the National Registry of Exonerations, of course, doesn't follow that. They have more examples, but that's because they count as false confession cases where somebody's conviction was reversed and then the case was dismissed, or the conviction was reversed and the jury acquitted. So there are different ways of counting the documented false confessions. The more methodologically rigorous ways is just those categories of provable false confession. But that means the numbers are going to be smaller.
Gracias. Las siguientes preguntas son para el Dr. Gould. La primera es, en los casos de abuso sexual, ¿existe algún tipo de registro que indique que esas condenas erróneas fueron basadas en pericias psicológicas o pericias psiquiátricas? Y a su vez, ¿qué protocolos se adoptan para evitarlas?
Well, there's no registry. There's no registry.
So I can answer part of this. There is no registry in the United States of sex crimes. You have to remember, as Professor Leo said, that we have 50 states, thousands of police departments and prosecutor offices in the United States. Getting them to agree even on their favorite ice cream flavor would be impossible. Getting them to collaborate to create a database of these kinds of crimes is impossible. So no, we do not have any record of all of those. I go around the world talking about erroneous convictions. Actually, most recently I was in China, and I have to say thank you for not having an agent from the government in the back monitoring everything that we are saying here today. But when I go abroad, especially to countries that are a national system, people cannot understand, they cannot believe that in the United States we don't have a central database. Because in a national system, it's easier to count, it is easier to record. In our federated system, the states would be the ones to be doing this, and we don't have it nationally. The second part of the question, I believe, was, is there any knowledge as to the psychological makeup of the people, or the psychological examinations of the people involved in these kinds of crimes? If there is, I am not aware of it, but maybe you are. Let's turn to you.
The sex crimes, in individual cases there's evaluations, but I don't think there's any systematic database that I'm aware of.
La siguiente pregunta es, ¿cuánto influye el discurso punitivista o la presión social en los medios de comunicación, de los medios de comunicación a los agentes del sistema penal, tanto al jurado como a los fiscales y jueces? ¿Y qué se puede hacer al respecto?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Such a wonderful question. I'm just beginning to learn how to read Spanish, so I don't yet know whether your media here are sensationalistic or not when it comes to crime. Right, so you're all nodding your heads yes. Is it as bad as Great Britain and New Zealand? So we have an expression in the United States that if it bleeds, it leads, which means that if there's a really gory crime, it's the first story that you're going to see in the newspapers, on television, online. That horrific crime that occurred weeks ago with Charlie Kirk was immediately on social media everywhere. And it understandably creates a sense of fear and horror and brings out a sense sometimes in all of us for vengeance. We want people who do horrible things to others to pay for that, whatever the penalty should be. I would argue that's human nature. And the challenge then is how do we get past human nature to say, we have another expression in English about our better angels. So the idea should be guiding our behavior. The idea is there's a good angel that sits on one shoulder and a bad angel that sits on the other shoulder, and we should be following the better angel. It is incredibly difficult to do that when there are newspapers, television stations, online media that are pumping out story after story, video after video of the crime. Think of the most horrific crime you can imagine we've had. But think of, for example, the rape and murder of children. It calls out in all of us for something to be done. We want someone penalized. In our country, at least at the moment, we still have the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of the press. It would be impossible for us under our law to restrict the media from reporting on things like that. So the solutions here have to be within the criminal justice system. So some of the things that we have seen would be, for example, if there is a very, very newsworthy crime that occurred in one jurisdiction in a state, sometimes the prosecution of that case will be moved to another jurisdiction in the state on the idea that maybe, as we say, cooler heads will prevail in that jurisdiction. It is sometimes also important to let the investigators do their investigation rather than having to have an answer now. But again, that is incredibly difficult to do in our system, where in most state jurisdictions, our chief prosecutors are elected politicians. And you can imagine the pressure they then face to solve the case. So one solution might be to do away with the elections of our chief prosecutors, as we have at the federal level, at the federal government level, and have them respond to these cases. I wish I had an easy answer for you. I see this in so many places around the world. I'm a member of the Bar of New Zealand, which over a drink I'll explain if you want. But it is a country that usually ranks very, very high on the list of countries that are economically advanced and socially and politically advanced with very high civil liberties as well. And yet they have one of the worst media cultures for crime, where it becomes almost impossible to do criminal justice reform. Because the moment there's any kind of crime, it's splashed all over social media and legacy media. And they feel that the prosecutors I know there who are looking for reform feel like they are handcuffed. So actually, I would be delighted to talk to you afterwards about what your ideas are for how we address that problem.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta es para saber si al gran jurado o al jurado se los instruye sobre la posibilidad de cometer errores o de que existan errores.
You're going to notice better than I do. So I'm actually going to turn it over to the person who still teaches criminal law. As a dean, I don't teach criminal law anymore, but Professor Leo's got this.
I don't know much about the grand jury, but I don't think they're instructed in terms of the jury, the petite jury or trial jury. They are told that they have to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, and that it's explained what that means to the court, what that means to the judge. I believe it's certainty of conviction beyond any doubt that would be considered reasonable. So it's just redefining it. Okay, so it's not that they're told about error; it's that they're educated about a standard that is believed to be set very high.
One other thing to think about with our grand jury system, and you do not have the grand jury system here, correct? Okay, so quickly, when prosecutors want to bring serious cases in many jurisdictions, they have to bring the case first to a grand jury, which is a group of citizens who meet on a regular interval. And the prosecutor shows them the evidence that they have, and they ask them whether they believe there is enough evidence for this case to go forward. It's probable cause that a crime has been committed. So to convict, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Probable cause is lower than that. Do we know what that exactly means? Absolutely not. But the thing I do know from having studied lots of prosecutor offices is that a good prosecutor can get any grand jury to either indict, if that's what the prosecutor wants, or to not move forward. We call that a no bill. The grand jury says there's not probable cause. A skilled prosecutor can get the grand jury to do whatever she wants them to do. And so the solution here isn't grand juries or what they're told. The solution here is the training of prosecutors and changing the incentive structure for prosecutors so that they are measured less by their conviction rates and more by their accuracy rates. In the United States, prosecutors in the 1980s mainly collected two kinds of data. They collected data on their caseloads, how many cases the office had, how many cases each individual prosecutor had, and their conviction rates. Did I get a conviction? In our system, 95% of all criminal convictions are secured by a plea bargain. So you can imagine it's not very hard to get a high conviction rate. If 95% of cases the defendant pleads guilty, then your conviction rate is no lower than 95%. Only recently, from about 2015 forward, has there been a rise in the United States of what we call progressive prosecutors. These are prosecutors who were elected saying they wanted to reduce the level of incarceration that they have in their jurisdictions, and many of them were concerned about racial biases and injustice in our system. Increasingly, they are collecting other kinds of data. They are looking, for example, at what is the race of the prosecutor who took the case, what is the race of the defendant who was charged, what was the charge, what was it bargained down to, how long was the sentence, and examining whether there were racial disparities there, and matching them against the race of the prosecutor, him or herself. They are incorporating other kinds of data as well, which is a huge step forward in our system. Because if it is true, as the saying goes in the United States, that a good prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich, then it is essential that we have prosecutors who are not only trained to do this, but are committed to achieving justice, not simply convictions.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta es si las víctimas de condenas injustas o erradas reclaman luego contra el gobierno estadounidense. Y si es así, ¿cuál es el porcentaje de los casos que llegan a algún tipo de resarcimiento?
So first of all, there's an easy answer to part of this, which is there's no mechanism to get compensation from the federal government. Remember that most of our criminal cases are handled by state governments or municipal governments. Whether defendants can get relief often depends on whether there is a statute in that state that authorizes relief. If there is, defendants can file a claim and seek recompense. Others have sometimes filed civil rights claims against criminal justice actors, prosecutors, or police officers, claiming that their civil rights were violated in the wrongful conviction and seeking compensation. I don't know that any of us knows exactly what the percentage is of people who have filed or get compensation, but we know simply by being in this world that it is very, very small. It is rare for someone to be compensated for the wrongful conviction. And when they are compensated, statute usually limits it to an amount of money that none of us would be satisfied with for having spent even one day wrongly convicted in prison.
Gracias. Esa era nuestra última pregunta. Muchas gracias a todos por participar. Gracias por sus preguntas. Muchas gracias primero a nuestros expositores.